Thank you, everyone. I want to echo what Sarabin said this morning in that this is a real privilege to be able to speak on our work. And as Joachim said, we presented on this work prior, and it's a really nice opportunity to come to the SWIB conference and share an update. And hopefully we can have conversation about the work either through Q&A or throughout the conference. So I'm going to be talking about the linked data for libraries, the linked data for production lookup service, and our change in direction really as it relates to caching lookups to support a lookup service. So a little bit of background, the Linked Data Authority Service is built on an application called Questioning Authority, and we've given plenty of presentations at SWIB about this work as it's been iterated on. One of the things I want to highlight today is what I think as the grant winds down, one of the major findings or major outputs of this work is a detailed understanding of what robust lookup services should entail. I'll talk about the opportunities and challenges with relying on cachings to support lookup services, and as describe our process for changing to a more API approach to supporting these services, largely because of sustainability reasons and anticipated personnel resources when the grant winds down to support the service. And a large portion of my talk here today will describe briefly, well, maybe not so briefly, support efforts to create a specification that may, or we hope will help support caching in the future. So just to ground the conversation, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about lookups is every cataloger is in a form, and some are free text fields, but we're here at a linked data conference where we want to encourage links. So this is a detail of a tool called Sinopia that Stanford's developing to create bibframe descriptions, and the person who created the form made some decisions about, or for a genre field in the form, what external vocabularies should be looked up against. And so I've typed in up here the text or the string speech, and I'm presented a list of results. The template creator decided that Library of Congress genre form headings, mesh publication types, and Getty object and genre vocabularies are what would be suitable for whatever this workflow is for the cataloger to link to. So we've attempted here to build an environment where we can give agency to the form creator to decide which vocabulary they want to search against. Somebody then selects a result in the search and it populates the form. A little bit about the environment up until recently. Well, currently this is how it looks. Starting on the right-hand side, we make selections, or we identify vocabularies that we want to support lookups for. We have infrastructure, at least through the grant, to support local caching and indexing, and then Questioning Authority provides a normalized response that Sinopia there on the left, when it passes that search through, can understand without having to know the specifics of any API implementations of the data sources themselves. So it's meant to simplify how cataloging tools interact or understand what's available in each of the different data sources. So briefly on the benefits of caching, we found that in working with catalogers, we really wanted some agency over relevancy, so we can tweak the indexes to conform to cataloger expectations about the types of terms and codes and labels and other fields that they've identified to search. We want to determine what data can display. So often with lookups, it focuses on the label, and that's not necessarily enough for a cataloger to make a confident selection. So we not only return labels, but other fields that the catalogers have identified to help them make that selection. And lastly, if the vocabulary itself goes down, our service could stay up and provide uptime. Like I said, one of the big benefits of this project is to capture cataloger expectations about how lookups can perform. And so this is a snippet, or a spreadsheet, where we have separate tabs for each vocabulary that's been identified, and there the cataloger or the person requesting the lookup can help us determine, in column C here, you see which fields should be searched and then which fields should display. And while this is not machine actionable, this information provided by the requester helped us to develop some relevancy strategies around which of the properties should be weighted more or less, so helping perform relevancy according to their expectations. So some of the costs and challenges that we're faced with as the grant winds down, and we knew some of this long before this, but we're really facing it now. So for each vocabulary that's identified, the indexing optimization for each vocabulary is pretty sophisticated, and it's not just a one-time thing. As a cataloger uses the lookup, we've been given requests to tweak those indexes. As you can all imagine, keeping caches up to date is a real struggle. We use data dumps from the different vocabularies, and they publish those data dumps with different frequencies. It could be daily, more often it's quarterly or monthly or even annually. And so a cataloger, one of the unsatisfying experiences is that a cataloger will have created an entity and then not see it in the lookup. And so Sinopia has created some workarounds around that, but we recognize that as one of the challenges. And then the overall cost of maintaining the environment and services is certainly there. So our plan now is to transition to API-based lookups. So those arrows in the middle right, instead of data dumps, Questioning Authority has this idea or an approach where it can translate the existing API into a regularized response that Sinopia can continue, and other cataloging tools can be built for, again, so that you don't have to understand however many lookups or how many data sets you might have identified as being needed. And I put an asterisk on the last slide because while we do want to move towards the API lookups, there are certain vocabularies that just don't provide a search API for us to make a translation in the QA layer. And Questioning Authority has this ability to create YAML files. They're sort of a static list that allows to capture the label and the identifier right within the QA app, so that you can have sort of a pick list to support in lieu of an API. And so I recognize some faces in the room that are using Sinopia. This may be the most detailed, up-to-date plan for swapping out those cached lookups. So currently I'm working with Nancy Lorimer at Stanford, who really has a sense of how Sinopia is being used and which vocabularies are critical moving forward. So there was an open invitation to request vocabularies throughout the grants, and we know now that many of them are being used, but there are a few that either lacked use or the use of them died down over time. And so we're really trying to prioritize effort for those vocabularies that are currently in use. And so what that looks like is we do some background analysis on that particular data set. QA, or Questioning Authority, is part of a larger effort in the Samvera community, and they have developed code for this API-based approach for a handful of vocabularies, and we hadn't necessarily been using all of that code and focusing more on the cached approach. So identifying if Samvera has already created some code to translate the APIs. If so, then can we just turn that on? If not, what I've done is identify APIs for each of the data sets, and we will create new code and configurations to support those. And like I said before, if there's no API, I'm going to be spending a fair amount of this fall creating those YAML files for vocabularies that don't have search APIs. And an example of this is the RDA value list. So the lists work really well for static small vocabularies, and so hopefully we can sort of thread the needle with what's been identified and come up with a feasible set of lookups for those vocabularies. We have 2 sprints. One starts later this month and another in October to begin doing this work. I'll create test templates in Sinopia to make sure they in fact work, and then communicate those lookups exist to template creators in Sinopia. And rather than just break things, we want to give time to the template editors to swap out their cache-based, if they are using cache-based lookups, out for the API-based lookups. So we're gaining some things and we're conceding some things with moving away from caching, and I wanted to outline those here today. So what we gained, so starting with the positives, the lookups will be more in sync with the official vocabularies to the extent that the APIs reflect the current state of those data sources. If you have edited a template in Sinopia, you'll know that there is some redundancy in the lookups that you can use. So some have the API and the cached. There will be no confusion going forward. There will just be the API-based lookups. And once set up, assuming the APIs don't change, there'll be little maintenance there. We'll see how long we can assume that. And what we give up. So we're limited by the data provider's choices with the API and relevancy. So whatever results they send back is what we get, and whatever data about those entities that comes back in the API, that's what we can work with. Whereas with the cache, we really had the whole graph to work with there. And of course, if the API goes down, QA won't be able to support a search. And like I said, we're threading a needle here, so there may be vocabularies that neither provide an API or are suitable for the YAML file approach. So we'll have to address that should it come up. So maybe moving on to the future and a hope for caching. The LD4 community has started up, well, quite some time ago now, an entity metadata management API specification group. And the idea here is to try to, in a more machine actionable way, be able to support caching in the long term. So the group is made up of, it has quite a diverse set of folks, though I'll acknowledge it's all folks from the United States. We have academic libraries, national libraries, data scientists, and domain libraries represented. And as Servan said earlier, with any sort of specification or standards work, it's the people who show up who get to decide, and here's the list of people who've chosen to show up. We have an open GitHub page where folks can make pull requests and follow the conversation there. We have a Slack channel where we do try to have pretty open communication, and asynchronous discussions between our meetings. They're out in the open as much as we can so folks can follow the work. So getting into what it is that we want this API to represent, we landed on these sort of three important moments in the life cycle of an entity. Creation, so we want to know when a new entity has been added to the data set, and so that we can pull that in for caching or whatever use case might come up. We want to know about updates, and so updates is a broad category of things, and some of those updates require more action than others. And then lastly, deletes or deprecation. So when have we been discouraged from using a term in a vocabulary? It's sort of an interesting talk to go after, Servin, when you're talking about building and matching what you're going to implement or build on. And we landed on activity streams. It's a W3 spec widely used in supports linked data. There's prior art, so we weren't just starting from scratch. The Getty Research Institute has an implementation for their vocabularies, and Library of Congress does as well. There are notable differences and subtle differences that we were trying to come to terms with. To the point about forces and functions that Servin made this morning, we really tried to map this to the simple requirement we had, which is awareness. So one-way communication. It wasn't that the consumers needed to report back, but activity streams allows for the data provider to message out to whomever the changes that are happening in the data set. And from a semantic point of view, the model provisions for activities or actions, or however you want to think of that, and they can be dated and typed in a way that makes it clear the kinds of changes and when those changes happened. It was nice to see in that presentation this morning the idea of extending. So the activity streams we've extended with this ability to have more nuanced types that aren't in the activities vocabulary and communicate precise changes, and I'll get into that in a sec. Yeah, so here. So the way this works is there's an entry point or an ordered collection, and those collections are made up of pages or change sets, and that can be determined, how that's organized is determined by the data provider. Each page is followed by another, and those pages are made up of activities. And from there, those activities may or may not have RDF patch to signal what what statements were added or deleted from the entity description. Really what it comes down to is the types of activities that are communicated for whatever object or whatever entity is being messaged about, and we've landed on creation and add for new entities that the consumer needs to pay attention to. Update is in the activities stream, activities vocabulary, and this is for a broad range of updates. And then we've decoupled deprecation and delete in that many vocabularies choose not to delete, but rather deprecate. So it still exists, it's still dereferenceable, but you're discouraged from using it. Whereas with deletes, the URI no longer dereferences, and the activity streams can provide a paper trail that it once existed. So we're concluding this work, and really we're at the stage we're at now is to do final edits. That includes anything from grammatical changes to making sure our examples are useful and legible and approachable. We want to communicate. We're doing a little bit of that here today, hoping for some feedback and to begin collecting use cases should we iterate on this and want to build off from this work. And lastly, like the W3C, we would love to see at least some preliminary implementations to test our assumptions, and we hope to have folks who can engage with this work and build consumer applications to help do what we set out to do. Like I said, we maintain hope for cache-based lookups. We've learned a lot about catalogers' expectations around what it is they want to look up. And it really comes down to each vocabulary. There's treatment for each vocabulary that doesn't necessarily translate for the next vocabulary that you want to look up for. And I just want to underscore that our transition to an API-based approach is really about resources and as the grant ends. And also, I think there's room in the community to collaborate on something like this. So if we pooled resources either through consortia or with the help of vendors, it seems like this work can be carried on, and with some combination of the data providers using activity streams and consortia to help build that infrastructure. There's just a little bit more work there to see this come into reality. And yeah, like I said, the activity streams, emerging practices for data providers could really improve the currentness of caches. I'll end there. There's some links if you want to delve deeper into our work. It's broken up by QA work and the entity management API. And maybe I'll leave it there, but is there time for questions?
Thank you very much, Stephen. And we have a lot of time for questions.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was wondering, the lookup function, does it also include wildcard support and Boolean operators? And is that also possible with the API-based approach?
So our indexing approach did include that, and definitely a lot of work for truncation and stemming and those sorts of things. When it comes down to translating the data provider's API, it's really what they support and our ability to translate that into the QA translation.
Further questions?
While the mic's moving around, I'll add to my answer in that there wasn't a lot of requests for Boolean from the catalogers. There seemed to be a real focus on keyword, just the way the web works. There was a lot of good response to just making sure the relevancy was spot on so that you didn't have to do complicated querying. Oh.
I just talk louder. Thank you very much, Stephen. From a technical point of view, have you considered using transparent HTTP caching to keep synchronized with fashioned repositories and just have an HTTP cache sort of in front of your own indexing? That would give you full control still over the indexing process without relying on APIs done by others, while still having a full cache of the data.
I'll be clear. I'm a metadata librarian here who facilitated the conversation between metadata folks and the developers. I'm not actually sure whether we would consider something like that, but we have somebody here who can maybe speak more to the technical stuff after. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, well, that's from the Sinopia side, so that if the form allows for that, then yes. It is a way, whether QA is working or not, if the cataloger knows the identifier for the resource. Yeah, that was one of the workarounds that I was talking about earlier, is exactly that, yeah. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering about your experience with the various APIs around, because my impression is that suppliers, even though they provide the API, they are not necessarily powered to handle, say, very frequent access. So have you had any experience with the
Yeah,
various?
so for LCSH, FAST, and a handful of vocabularies, we already have experience with what we call direct lookups or the API-based approach, and we've received no complaints. I think if Sinopia were to be a production environment, maybe we would have to evaluate the pressure caused on those APIs.
Hi, Steven. I've got a question. I hope I've not missed your point a point in the presentation. How do you handle co-reference links? So, in case those APIs would spit out concepts that are actually matches of each other because they do represent the same entity. Yeah, how do you handle that? And is it easier or harder with the API-based approach?
I missed the first part of the question.
So when in your, I mean, when you look up in different vocabularies, you may find concepts that are actually the same. And how do you handle that? And isn't it harder in a pure API-based implementation? Because if you cache it, then probably you know those links in advance, and it's easier to exploit them.
Well, so we have separate calls against each data set. So maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but if Getty has a term for the concept and LC has a term for the concept, it's really up to the cataloger to choose which they prefer, and they could link to both in the way that Mark currently allows you to have subject headings or headings from multiple vocabularies for the same term.
And they're not asking for some kind of grouping of those matches? I mean, if there's a term that shows first and then the same term that shows on the 10th position, maybe there could be... well, actually, I'm interested to hear if they have not raised that requirement, then that's for you.
Yeah, there's some work that we've done to think about like the semantics within a vocabulary. So how we might provide a list of results, and one of the things the catalogers identified was broader and narrower. So they may put in search term or the search term speech, but what they really want is a narrow. The thing that they're talking about is a more narrow form of speech, and so we've talked about making not only the context that displays in the result sets visible, but browsable, so you can move within a vocabulary. If vocabularies have a same as or equivalent relationship, similarly, we could bounce in between vocabularies to choose to link to another term rather than the one that's displaying immediately in the result set. Another part of the work that you couldn't see in the screenshots was the template provider can choose how many results show up in the page. And we have this idea of pagination. So you can, our relevancy isn't perfect. No relevancy can understand the intention of the search. And so the idea of paging through a list of results until you find something similar to any other sort of search behavior. But no, we haven't. The caches live independent of each other. Maybe that would have been an easier way to answer your question, is that they're each a separate cache, separate store, separate index. So each call is happening. We haven't really we don't have a big graph that is messy, especially given that each vocabulary requires like understanding the modeling and so on. So there's not like this uber knowledge graph that we're doing cross vocabulary searching on.